George Santayana was a Spanish-American philosopher and writer whose legacy is significant in contemporary aesthetics, political philosophy and literary criticism. Born in 1863 in Spain, he spent many years in the US, where he was a student at Harvard and later a professor there. He gave up his academic career and left America in 1912 to spend the rest of his life in France, England and finally in Italy, where he died in 1952. To his most influential books in academic circles belong The Life of Reason and The Realms of Being. However, he was also the author of two bestsellers, The Last Puritan and Persons and Places, and is nowadays popularly recognized for his sayings, the most famous of which reads, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." His main philosophical achievement has been to show that imagination and spirituality have naturalistic and biological origin.
George Santayana was a Spaniard, a native-born Spaniard who was removed at the age of 8 to the United States to live with his American family, American side of his family, I should say. And I mentioned that first and foremost because he became a world-famous philosopher, and it's kind of remarkable that he had this kind of bicultural background, you might say. A very unique world philosopher who became categorized as an American philosopher.
Then became a professor at Harvard. But he retired from Harvard at the age of 48 in 1912 because he thought Harvard was becoming too businesslike and not fostering intellectual development of faculty or students. And he spent the rest of his life living in just terrible places like the Riviera, Paris, Rome, and Madrid.
Well, obviously he was a philosopher of Spanish ascent who left a huge amount of writings. He was a scriptomaniac. I think it was really almost a pathology of writing. And other than that, he managed to put a lot of interesting philosophical thought into his mania. I think that's as much as you could say in a very compressed definition of who he was. What else would be really essential? Well, let's stick to that.
Santayana was, in my view, one of the most interesting thinkers, philosophers, writers, man of letters in the 20th century. A man who bridged two cultures, who though born European, spent roughly 40 years of his life on the other side of the Atlantic, and yet who returned for his last years of his life to Europe. A man who dealt with issues and thoughts and times and circumstances that which allowed him to understand both Europe and the United States in ways that very few figures in the history of thought have been able to do. And this allows Santayana that privileged position, I think, for many people of understanding this dynamic between Europe and the United States. I think it's a fantastic example of someone who was aware of both sides issues of the Atlantic, and someone who dealt seriously with the sensibilities and the thoughts of not only the 20th century, but from these two perspectives.
Santayana was and has been a famous philosopher, a Spanish-American thinker with great number of interesting books, essays, and a thinker that has been influential in some circles, despite his difficult language. In some of his texts, his language is easy and attractive, but in most of his philosophical texts his language is very difficult, and you have to be a really sophisticated or well-educated philosophically a person to want to read him. And so what some people, including me, are trying to do is to make his thought more popular by using a less sophisticated language and less sophisticated means of articulation, for example, in social media.
One, imagination is natural. Humans have it, but also animals have it, as they think through things, imagine possibilities, etc. But imagination is something that occurs after the physiological events. It's something that's a reflection on what's happening, and it's a reflection as to what is possible. So it's physiological, it's generated by one's physical being and the circumstances around, and yet you can't reduce it just to those physical circumstances and the culture.
Imagination. I think this is one of the most important features in his writings. Imagination is a main thing in people's life. If you don't have imagination, you have nothing. But it's not useful only to poetry. It's a useful content to life.
Maybe he was more a hero of the imagination than a saint of the imagination. It's a fundamental, I would say also that it's, as a philosopher, he's a singer of imagination. He really makes eloge of imagination, praise of imagination, and he demonstrated great imagination in many aspects of his philosophy. The way he thinks of truth is really a feat of imagination. The way his theory of essences, in a way, it doesn't really stand as a product of reason, but as a product of imagination. I think it's an interesting production. So yes, what he thought imagination was, how he theorized it. I don't think there's many. There is in Sartre you have a theory of the imaginary. I don't think there's much theory of imagination in a way in Santayana, but there's great practice of imagination, whatever it is.
Based more in a naturalistic sense of emerging in a naturalistic context of emerging from the body, from material forces. It is an idealization of these animal tensions and perceptions, which becomes beauty, and which leads to, of course, to a sense of beauty, but which for Santayana was always he had a very clear sense that imagination could never be just fancy or that which was not real. For Santayana, the imagination should always be grounded in a sense of reality, in a sense of what we see before us, in a sense of a world that we are a part of. And this basis, a naturalistic basis of the imagination, also should never take any wild leaps of fancy to worlds that don't exist, because that would be betraying what we are, which are basically animals.
Well, on that, I think he was not a very experienced. He probably had some interesting theoretical views, but as far as we know, there isn't much practical. As far as we know, he was probably gay, apparently. How I think he was probably a Platonic thinker of love. The idea that particular loves tend to have to be in a way abstracted from, and in order to that eros become some kind of charitable, going from eros to caritas was probably, I would say, philosophically his main take on love.
I think it's a very important part of the human experience, he saw it as, in a broad way, I think sort of as Aristotle in terms of friendship, in terms of people relating to each other and mutuality, seeing people and respecting the other person. I think that would be his idea of love, and not just something that has a sexual base. It's more broad.
Interestingly, Santayana was trying to cope, philosophically speaking, with naturalism and Platonism at the same time. So he theoretically or philosophically, he produced an idea that love is generated biologically, however, by means of imagination and projection of ideals, which is a part of biological life, according to Santayana. We have in love ideas or essences that are as if imposed upon the object of our love. So what we really love, according to him, apart from desire, I'm not talking about desire, I'm not talking about attraction, I'm not talking about fascination, I'm talking about love. For him, love is when we impose our ideal visions onto a person we love. So one may conclude that in Santayana we do not love the persons, we love the ideas that are, or we expect that can be embodied by these persons, or by means of these persons, or within these persons, right? So when we change the object of our love, we can do it by not changing our ideals of love.
Santayana is a therapeutic philosopher. I think in this day and age of self-help, where people are, and psychologism, where people are seeking quick, easy, small packaged, ready-made answers to tough questions, Santayana's not an easy sell because he, is very verbose, wrote a lot of works, and his thoughts are very rich. That said, for that same reason, I think that Santayana, for the patient reader, for the person who can listen to the thoughts that he conveys, is therapeutic. He offers a humane way of coming to terms with this very tumultuous and sometimes even threatening world.
His message for the contemporary world is we have a choice as to how to live. We don't have a choice in being born. We don't have a choice in dying. But as he says, we do have a choice to make the interval delightful. So the feature for Santayana is really quite individualistic, that each individual chooses what's important for them and develops a life that has the value that is made up of significant things for them. It was what Santayana called the spiritual life, but not meaning spirit in the sense of a soul, or even spirit in the sense of a religious sense. Every human being has a consciousness, and the way we live that consciousness and what we foster in it, that's what is the structure of our lives.
Well, that's a very interesting idea. I think that Santayana could apply to many people in the world without most people realizing it. Santayana had a very incredible sense of the ordinary world, of the everyday world. He was someone who constantly was trying to square his life with what he saw around him, whatever the situation or circumstance might be. He was constantly not obsessed, but rather preoccupied with his daily life, the everyday for Santayana was crucial in the happiness and the fulfillment of a human being, in that it was what grounded and contextualized all of human efforts. So whether one really is involved in cultivation of a field, raising animals, driving a bus, Santayana thought that the activity of that day, the everyday, was important for every person, and this that the world being plural that it is, there are a variety of avenues open for people in all walks of life to enjoy and appreciate the everyday world, which is what we all basically have.
I think that we are human beings who have a great range of possibilities. He talked about freedom to be oneself as a very important freedom, and also moral freedom, in which our values allow us to live in harmony with ourselves and the world. And so I think beauty is about harmony. And so to live a beautiful life, I think, was important to Santayana. I think because of his, in a sense, multilingual, multicultural background, he brings something to American philosophy, which is my area, that broadens the scope of American philosophy and helps us see it as a broader kind of philosophy that can speak to everyone.
Part of the reason I did my dissertation on Santayana is the same reason he's important to me. Dissertations are arduous. One spends one's time working on them, parsing them, getting the right words, the right arguments, etc. My view, a rather selfish view, was that whenever I grew tired of the dissertation and the day-to-day writing, I could turn to his poetry, I could turn to his cultural criticism, his novel, and his autobiography. People forget his novel was the best-selling book in the United States for about 6 months. And his autobiography, the first book he was on, was the best-selling book in the United States for longer than the autobiography. So reading those while I was doing the arduous work of a dissertation was a great delight. And Santayana is like that. He has these incredibly complex philosophical approaches to many topics. But then he is able to set aside, write a novel, do poetry, do cultural criticism, and doing it while he enjoys life.
I hooked into Santayana at the very beginning of my undergraduate studies, and it was because of his sensibility. Santayana has the most worldly sensibility of a philosopher that I've read. I would even argue now, after years of study of other philosophers. So it's his worldly sensibility, his ability to hold together at once a myriad of very complicated things and to not have them unravel in his hands as he's conveying these ideas in his writings and so forth. So I connect with that very, very deeply.
Well, for me, it's a companion in a way. It's a companion who lost his mother tongue as a working language. He lost. So it's a mirror in a way. I project a lot of things into Santayana, and in a way, it gave me a possibility to do. I come from a very analytical and engineering background, and it gave me a possibility to talk and to think in a very relaxed way about many topics that deep down interest me a lot, both art, our relation to animals, our relation to food, our relation to literature, and the fact that, yeah, I guess it's important because finally, in spite of occasional disagreements, I find his outlook on life sane, reasonable, commonsensical, humorous, and full of charm. And he's a philosopher who is full of full of charm, and that's also an important aspect of philosophy.
Santayana has always been interesting to me. I found, on a personal note, I found myself reading him in my late 20s, even prior to studying him formally in a university. There's something about his life, his literary engagements, his poetry, his essays, and also his life. I've always found that his own life of being not active in the world was one that was always fascinating for me, and that he lived 89 years. He saw a lot of the world in both the 19th and 20th century, and he was he could comment on that. He could give us a panorama of the life as it changed from his birth in 1863 to his death in 1952. He was a great witness to the 20th century and how we live.
Firstly, he was important for me only because of his aesthetics. But later I found different things at him. So after the verses and after writings about beauty, I found very important critical thoughts. For example, political things, and most importantly, because of his life, because he tried to live his life as an ancient philosopher, like a Stoic or philosophy was a form of life for him, not only a science, not only an academic subject, but a way of life.
I'd like to think I do anything at all to make others potentially interested in Santayana. If I do, I'm very happy with that. But I just bow to people who've already accomplished a great deal, like John Lachs and Herman Saatkamp, and on and on and on. There's so many wonderful philosophers and scholars of philosophy who have contributed to his advancement. Myself, I consider myself a scholar and not a philosopher, so for that same reason, I'm a historian of ideas, and I'd like to think I've made some contributions to that in regard to Santayana as an individual. I did do the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry. I'm very proud of that, to say that students of Santayana might encounter my descriptions of his thinking is a very kind of nice thought. I like that.
Oh, it's very modest. I suppose every Santayana scholar that you'll interview will tell you that it's very modest, but some of those you have interviewed are falsely being modest because their contribution is important. Mine is really marginal. I have written a few papers that explore aspects of Santayana that have been somewhat neglected. Talk about animals, about food, about his relation to French culture, which has not been taken up in general. So it is truly a modest contribution, but I still hope to bring a few modest contributions, and I'm working on a book which is partly philosophical and partly literary, that may add something a little bit more significant than what I have done until now.
Well, I had the great fortune of studying with some great Santayana people, among them John Lachs, but now my work has turned to more of an intellectual, historical, biographical understanding of Santayana. I've written essays. I've recently published a translation of another Santayana scholar from Spanish to English, but now I'm focused on writing perhaps an intellectual biography of Santayana, in which, in the great tradition of intellectual biographies, I want to really do an exhaustive study, not so much of his philosophy, but of his life.
I have not written much on Santayana, but I have studied him, and I intend to write more.
Well, I try to talk in Hungary about Santayana. in Hungary he's totally unknown. So I think I can say something of his aesthetics, his philosophy, and the person, because he is completely unknown.
Well, I've written a couple of things, but the main on Santayana, but the main contribution is collecting scholars from different parts of the world and to organize meetings, conferences, and sessions dedicated to Santayana and the exchange of thought and making so many different people from so many different countries talking about Santayana. Because I organized the event, this gives me a lot of satisfaction. This film was prepared and produced by Berlin Practical Philosophy International Forum EV on the occasion of the International Conference on Santayana that took place in 2016 in Berlin, Germany.